Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Lara Villamot. I am the head of outreach and community experience at the Framingham Public Library. Welcome to tonight's lifelong learning session. It is our very first session for the winter spring. And our first guest presenter tonight hardly needs any introduction. We are thrilled to welcome Dr. David Smailes. He will be talking about a president like no other, Andrew Jackson. Sorry, I've got a slight echo. There we go. So this is a partnership between Framingham State University and the Framingham Public Library. And we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Smailes here tonight. He's an associate professor in the political science department at Framingham State University. And he is also the program director and instructor for the Masters in Public Administration program at FSU. And he is a frequent presenter on American politics in all sorts of venues all around the Metro West area. A few quick announcements before we get started. We will have, as you've seen on your screen pop up, or she probably told you in your ear, tonight's lifelong learning session is recorded. So if you know anybody who wasn't able to make it, please direct them to our YouTube page in a couple of days, or if you'd like to watch the lecture again, we'd love to see you there. I am going to be adding an evaluation form to our chat box. Please feel free to click on it and let us know what you thought about tonight's event, if you have any suggestions for any future topics. And we would love for you to join our mailing list if you are interested in other library programs. Of course, we will never use your information for anything other than telling you about that. And so with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Smailes. Welcome.
Thanks, Laura. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight and joining us. I'm always very happy to be a part of this series, and it's always so great to see so many people interested in lifelong learning and the topics that are presented as part of this series. So thank you all very much. We're going to be talking tonight about Andrew Jackson, and I've titled this presentation "A President Like No Other" because I do think that Jackson was rather unique in many ways as a president and played a very interesting role in shaping attitudes towards the presidency. So I'm going to talk about that subject for about a half hour, maybe 40 minutes, and then I'm going to leave the rest of the time for questions that you might have. So as I'm speaking and as we are going through this, if something comes to mind that you'd like to ask or an observation you'd like to make, feel free to go ahead and post that in chat, and then Laura will field some of those chat questions for us when we get to that part of the program. I'm also open to talking about anything having to do with the presidency or politics. We don't have to restrict ourselves just to the presentation topic tonight. But I do think it's an interesting topic because Jackson is a very interesting president. And I think in many ways we have to think of Jackson as a kind of Janus-like figure, the old Roman god with the two faces facing in opposite directions. I want to start with the less attractive face and then focus on the perhaps more attractive face because it's really the focus of our topic tonight. I think we have to acknowledge from the very beginning that there is a very ugly side to Andrew Jackson. Jackson, of course, it was one of many people who enslaved other human beings. In fact, he had a very large number of slaves at the Hermitage at his plantation in Tennessee. So I think very rightfully there's been some criticism of histories that have tended to gloss over that fact, as well as Jackson's role in dealing with Native American tribes in the South during his career, even during his presidency, the Trail of Tears, as it's called, and so on. I think we have to acknowledge that sort of negative side of Jackson's biography before we begin to talk about the other side of it. But it's the other side that I really want to focus on tonight, the side of his presidency and the side that others have really praised in many ways as a guide for themselves in their attitude towards the presidency. In fact, Franklin Roosevelt himself at one point said, "The more I learn about Andy Jackson, the more I love him," which is sort of an interesting observation from a president who really saw himself in the tradition of Andrew Jackson. And Franklin Roosevelt wasn't the only one who had that view of Jackson. Theodore Roosevelt, the very first arguably modern president, back at the turn of the last century, paid a visit to the Hermitage, had coffee at the Hermitage with the survivors, the remainders of Jackson's family, called him Good King Andrew by the end of his visit. Not only did Franklin Roosevelt make a similar pilgrimage on his way to Warm Springs, that's when he actually said this quote. Lyndon Johnson paid a visit to Jackson's homestead in 1967 for the 200th anniversary of Jackson's birth. Ronald Reagan paid a visit to Jackson's home, as well as on the 215th anniversary of his birth in 1982. And a little more recently, Donald Trump, when he was president, had a portrait of Andrew Jackson hung in the Oval Office. In fact, right next to the resolute desk that the president sits in the Oval Office. It's a place more or less of honor for pictures that presidents have chosen to place there because they're immediately to their right. And Trump clearly thought of that as a sort of symbolic nod to Andrew Jackson and what Jackson represented. No other president had a portrait there for many, many years. In fact, for about 50 years. The last president who had a portrait there was actually Lyndon Johnson, and he also hung Andrew Jackson in that place. So I think it's worth thinking about the fact that these two very different presidents both put Jackson in a place of honor in their White Houses. So I want to talk about why that's the case, what it is about Jackson that attracted these presidents to heap this kind of praise on Jackson, and how Jackson really shaped the presidency. Well, to understand that, we have to put Jackson in a context. When the founders wrote the Constitution and they conceived of the presidency in Article 2, they had a very different presidency in mind than the one we think of today. We think of presidents as political leaders, as having an agenda of advancing political ideas, particularly around domestic policy as well as foreign policy. We expect presidents to be at the center of our politics, but that's clearly not the way the founders conceived of the office. Article 1, of course, in the Constitution is about Congress. They thought Congress would be the center of government. And the president had a very different kind of role in their minds than the one that we attribute to presidents today. And I think we can get a hint of that by the fact that in Article 2, the president is the only office, the presidency is the only office that requires an oath of office be taken before assuming office. Now, I know you've probably seen, I know I have, other instances of people taking an oath before they take office. Supreme Court justices have a swearing-in ceremony, members of Congress have a swearing-in ceremony, but none of that is constitutionally required. That has all been a part of tradition. But the president is required to say these words before assuming the presidency. I do, and we've heard these, I'm sure, many a times, all of us, but I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Now, I think probably most of us, when we hear those words, we think of the commander-in-chief power, especially in that last part, right? The swearing to the best of my ability to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. We think of that perhaps in national security terms, but the founders really had a very different notion in mind. They thought the president was supposed to be the defender of the Constitution itself. So when Congress writes a law, or I should say passes a bill and sends it to the president for either signature or veto or pocket veto, the president was supposed to look at the law, or I should say, look at the bill, look at the Constitution, and decide whether or not that bill follows the Constitution. If it does, the president signs it. If it does not, the president vetoes it. The president was given the veto power then to defend the Constitution itself. Presidents really weren't expected to have any kind of political leadership in the way that we think of it today. They weren't supposed to lead on domestic issues. They were supposed to really, in many ways, protect the Constitution and serve as commander-in-chief when necessary, when the country was threatened and the country went to war after Congress would declare war. So the early presidents had a very different kind of view of the presidency, not one of leadership. And I think, for many of us, we probably have lived this. If you ever had to memorize the names of the presidents of the United States, we're okay with the first ones, right? Because it's the Revolutionary War people. So Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, those are all pretty easy. But then you get into people like James Buchanan and James Polk and so on. And we begin to sort of say, well, I can't really remember anything about those presidents. There's a good reason for that. Those presidents weren't real leaders at their time. Congress was really the place where politics took place back in the 1800s. If you remember in your American history on the slavery question, all the big debates around slavery and the attempts to hold the Union together took place in Congress, right? The Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and so on. Presidents were not supposed to lead in any real sense. And that's what made Jackson stand out among these 19th century presidents. In fact, I'll show you just how far you can really take this. When Lord James Bryce visited the United States in the late 1800s, he wrote a book called The American Commonwealth to try to explain American government to his English reading public back home in Britain. And he titled one of his chapters on the presidency, Why Great Men Are Not Chosen President, which is a very interesting title when you think about it. And one of the reasons that Bryce gave was that great men really aren't needed in the presidency. The presidency is really a very kind of mundane office, he thought. It's really only about executing the law, making sure laws are carried out, maintaining the public peace, and filling offices with appointees. A very kind of managerial sort of, or administrative sort of job. And he said, you don't need eloquence, brilliance, or imagination to do any of those things. You just have to be a good administrator. In fact, Bryce said, and I think it's a very telling quote, 4/5 of the president's work is the same kind that devolves on a chairman of a commercial company or the manager of a railway. That gives you an idea of the expectations that people had of presidents back then. Now, I say that as a preface because that's what makes Jackson stand out. Of all the presidents in the 1800s, Jackson and I would argue Lincoln, another subject for another night perhaps, both of them stand out among these presidents because they both played a very different role in the presidency during this time. Lincoln, of course, largely because of the Civil War, and even Lincoln acknowledged that. But Jackson, because of Jackson's personality. Jackson is the exception that proves the rule. He's the one that stands out among all these other presidents in the 19th century as a president who behaved very differently in office. And it's one of the reasons why he both inspires people, other presidents clearly, and at the same time drew a lot of criticism, was seen as almost a dictator of sorts because of his attitude towards the presidency. So let me explain how that worked. In 1824, Jackson ran for the presidency against three other people, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, William Crawford, and of course, Jackson himself. And in the election of 1824, very interesting result happened. Roughly 113,000 people voted for John Quincy Adams, 47,500 roughly for Henry Clay. William Crawford, sorry, I have to move my little icon here. William Crawford, about 40,000, close to 41,000. Jackson, 151,000. Jackson clearly had a majority or the largest number of popular votes. But of course, popular vote doesn't elect presidents, right? The Electoral College vote does. Adams won 84 Electoral College votes, Clay 37, William Crawford 41, and Jackson 99. So Jackson won the most elector votes in 1824, but he did not win a majority. And because of that, the election was sent to the House of Representatives to be decided, as the Constitution requires. And John Quincy Adams was actually named president. Jackson, of course, was furious, right? He won the most votes. He won the most elector votes. Jackson was convinced that he should have been named president, but instead, the House of Representatives chose John Quincy Adams. And as a result, Jackson carried for a very long period of time a deep resentment over the Electoral College. He thought that the election had been stolen from him. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's the same sort of argument that we've heard more recently. Jackson was convinced there was some kind of deal that was cut between Adams and Henry Clay to deny him the majority in the Electoral College that he needed to be elected. And so in 1828, when Jackson ran again against John Quincy Adams now running for re-election, no other candidates were in the race but these two. And as you can see, Jackson not only won a majority of the popular vote, but he also ended up winning a very decisive vote in the Electoral College. So Jackson's election in 1828 began almost immediately with this sort of cloud over it, a kind of resentment that Jackson had towards the way in which he had been denied the election in 1824. Not to mention the fact that Jackson's wife died just a few weeks after the election took place. And Jackson thought that one of the reasons she died of a heart attack. And Jackson was convinced one of the reasons that she had had this heart attack was because of the stress that was put on her because of many of Jackson's critics during the election of 1828. So this is a person who assumes office with a great deal of resentment at political opponents. And Jackson's sort of fiery side, if you will, combative side of president came out. Jackson is a leader of a movement, a democratic movement in American politics that many people point to, a kind of populist movement, if you will, that the common person should be in charge of government, should be directing American democracy, and so on. This quote in particular says a great deal about Jackson's attitude towards positions in government. The duties of all officers are, or at least admit to be, so plain and simple that men of intelligence may readily qualify themselves for their performance. And I cannot but believe there is much more is lost by the long continuance of men in office than is generally to be gained by their experience. In other words, what Jackson was saying is government jobs should be done by, or could be done by, anybody. You don't need to have people with a lot of experience in government to make government work. Well, that kind of populist attitude, of course, also drew criticism. Jackson was accused of using political appointments to reward his supporters. And so the spoils system, as it was called, the appointment of political supporters to office, became associated with Jackson and Jackson's view of how government should work. So that populist side of Jackson, as I say, also became a source of real criticism of Jackson because of Jackson's attitude towards the way in which he felt the government should work. But beyond that, Jackson's cabinet was known to be one of great disagreement and controversy, even among his closest advisors. His kitchen cabinet, as they were called, had a great deal of conflict, a number of people resigning over the years from Jackson's cabinet, overturning. In fact, the entire cabinet resigned at one point early in his first administration. Literally everyone just kind of walked out on him. It was depicted as rats running from the sinking ship by some of his political opponents. And Jackson's also was seen as distributing these sort of rewards to supporters and demanding a kind of personal loyalty to Jackson as a result. So again, this notion of high turmoil within the White House, this idea of demanding personal loyalty and so on, certainly qualities, again, that have been reflected in recent years in the way in which politics has operated in America. And Jackson, in a very similar kind of way, came under criticism as a result of all that. But with all the many things that happened in Jackson's administration, the one I want to focus on tonight is a controversy over something called the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States was created back around the time of George Washington's administration at the insistence of Alexander Hamilton. The bank was created to take on the debt that had been incurred during the Revolutionary War, to finance American politics. Essentially, the bank of the government would be the Bank of the United States. The bank was very controversial when it was created. In fact, many states resented the national bank and all of its outlets in their individual states. The national bank, because it was so large, could actually give very competitive rates of interest to people who were borrowing money. And so they tended to close out competition from all the state banks in the states where they operated. And as a result, many of these state banks began to go under. It's a little bit like a big retail box store coming in and driving out all the mom and pop stores in a particular town. So the state government sued the government in its use of the national bank. And John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1816, in a decision called McCulloch versus Maryland, decided that the national bank, in fact, was constitutional, that Congress had the power to create a bank and to use a bank to do things like regulating commerce and coining money and so on, powers that were clearly given to the Congress and the Constitution, and said the bank was just a necessary and proper way of carrying out those constitutional powers. Now, that important Supreme Court decision in 1816 is at the heart of this controversy in Jackson's years. So it's important for us to keep in mind that the Supreme Court had pronounced the national bank constitutional. In Jackson's presidency, an election was coming up in 1832. And Jackson's main political opponents in Congress, Henry Clay on the left and Daniel Webster from Massachusetts on the right, wanted to create essentially a campaign issue that they knew they could use to go after Andrew Jackson. And the issue they came up with was the rechartering of this national bank. They believed that the bank would be a very unpopular institution, a very popular institution, and if Jackson was to veto it, they were convinced Jackson's veto could be used against him in the election of 1832. So long before it had to be done, they brought a bill in Congress in the summer of 1832 to recharter the national bank. In other words, to vote on renewing the charter of the bank so it would continue, knowing full well that Jackson was likely to veto that particular charter. And as I say, they were hoping to use it as a political issue to essentially cook the goose of the sitting president and put one of their own supporters in office in 1832. In fact, Henry Clay himself was planning to run for the presidency. Well, in fact, when the bank bill came to Jackson's desk in July of 1832, Jackson indeed did veto that piece of legislation. And his veto was a very controversial decision. In fact, probably one of the most controversial decisions that he made during his presidency. So every time a president vetoes a bill, a president has to issue a message explaining why that veto has been given. And so Jackson did that when he vetoed the bill in the summer of 1832. He told Martin Van Buren, the bank is trying to kill me, sir, but I will kill it. and the tool or the weapon of choice, of course, is this presidential veto. Now, Jackson has a problem with this, right? Because normally when presidents vetoed bills, as I said earlier, they vetoed them because they were unconstitutional in the mind of the president. The president looks at the bill, looks at the Constitution, and decides whether or not this bill matches what the Constitution says. If it does, the president signs it. If not, the president vetoes it. In this case, of course, the Supreme Court had decided the bank was, in fact, constitutional in 1816 in McCulloch versus Maryland. So Jackson is going to have a hard time vetoing this bank bill. If he vetoes it and says it's because it's unconstitutional, well, there's a Supreme Court decision that already says it is constitutional. So that's going to be very difficult grounds to stake out. So when Jackson issues his veto message, he has several parts to it. And it's a very interesting way that he went about making his argument. First, he said the bank is just bad policy, that it really benefited the North to the expense of the South and the Midwest and the Western states, that people from foreign countries that had invested in the national bank were benefiting from the bank, so they were taking money out of the country, again, to the detriment of the people living in the United States. It's just a bad idea to have this bank, Jackson said. Now, as I say, Jackson couldn't rest his veto on those grounds because presidents weren't supposed to veto bills because they didn't like them. They were supposed to veto them because they were unconstitutional. So for the very first time, a president actually was using the veto power in a new way to actually say there is a policy reason why I think this bill should be vetoed. Something we take for granted today that presidents do all the time, right? Congress sends them a bill, they decide if they think it's good policy. If not, they veto it. But Jackson was the first to really assert that kind of reason for vetoing a piece of legislation. But he didn't leave it at that. And that's where our story gets very interesting when it comes to presidential power. As I say, the constitutional grounds had already been decided in McCulloch versus Maryland. So Jackson has to come up with a constitutional reason to veto this bill, even though the Supreme Court has already said it is constitutional to have this Bank of the United States. So how Jackson does that is very interesting. Jackson says that mere precedent, in other words, the earlier decision by the court, McCulloch versus Maryland, mere precedent is a dangerous source of authority. It should not be regarded as the deciding questions of constitutional power except where the acquiescence of the people and the states can be considered as well. In other words, what Jackson was asserting at the very beginning here is that the Supreme Court should not have final say in what is constitutional and what is not. Now, the people in the states had already spoken on this issue. Different Congresses, he said, representing the people, had voted in favor of the bank at times and against the bank at times, each time that it had to be renewed, its charter had to be renewed. And so he said that many of the states had also passed opinions in their state legislatures against the bank. And that certainly was true. The bank had had a very sort of rocky history of being favored and then not favored and then favored again. And Jackson said there is nothing in precedent then, given there's been no consistency in this, which by its authority were admitted ought to weigh in favor of the act before me. In other words, Jackson was saying there's not a clear reason why this precedent should be followed because the people and their representatives have never expressly said that they approve of the decision in McCulloch versus Maryland. And Jackson goes even further than that, though. He says it's up to Congress and the president to decide what the Constitution means, not just the members of the Supreme Court. The president and Congress should weigh into these questions as well. In fact, he says the authority of the Supreme Court must not therefore be permitted to control the Congress or the executive when acting in their legislative capacities, but only have such influence as the force of their reasoning may deserve. In other words, what Jackson was saying was, as president, I don't have to follow McCulloch versus Maryland. I don't have to obey what the Supreme Court decided in 1816. I can read it. I can decide based on my reading of their decision whether or not I think maybe they're right. But ultimately, I have to decide for myself, looking at this bill before me, whether or not I consider it constitutional, whether the Supreme Court has already said that it is or not. And the Congress has to do the same thing. Now, here's the problem with that argument. Congress had already decided that. They had already made their decision. Henry Clay and Daniel Webster had gotten this bill passed by the Congress. This bill is in front of the president and being decided on by the president because the Congress has spoken on this issue. They've said they consider the bank constitutional, and so they passed this bill to recharter the bank. So Congress has already, in its legislative capacity, agreed that this bank is constitutional. So Jackson tells us the people have to decide. Well, that's a mixed bag, so we don't really know for sure what the people think. And Congress has to decide this, but Congress already has. They've already decided that they consider the bill to be constitutional because they passed it. And certainly they're following McCulloch versus Maryland in making that decision. So in other words, what all this amounts to is that one person and one person alone is going to decide what the Constitution means when it comes to this national bank. Not the Supreme Court in McCulloch versus Maryland, not the people, not the Congress, but ultimately Andrew Jackson. The president alone is going to decide the constitutionality of this bank that's before the president in this bill. And of course, because Jackson is vetoing it, we know he's deciding that it's not constitutional. This was a breathtaking grab of power on the part of Andrew Jackson, because in essence, what he was saying was the Supreme Court is not the ultimate authority on the Constitution. Congress is not the ultimate authority on the Constitution. The people themselves are not the ultimate authority of the Constitution. The president and the president alone, in this case in particular, is the ultimate authority on the Constitution. That's a pretty dramatic grab of power. And had Jackson's decision really in many ways become the precedent for other presidents to do this, we would have a very different political system than we have today, given the power of the Supreme Court and the court's role in deciding what the Constitution means. By the way, his critics jumped all over this. Daniel Webster got up almost immediately in the Senate after this veto message was issued and said, the president may say the law is unconstitutional, but he is not the judge. Who decides that question? The judiciary alone possesses the unquestionable and hitherto, nobody had ever said this stuff before that Jackson's saying, and hitherto unquestioned right. The judiciary is the constitutional tribunal of appeal for the citizens against both the Congress and executive with regard to constitutionality of laws. And when it decides a question, its judgment must, by the very nature of all judgments that are final and from which there is no appeal, be conclusive. There was no question in Daniel Webster's mind, no question in the minds of Jackson's critics that Jackson had gone too far with this, that he had really reached beyond the power that was intended for presidents in using the veto power and deciding on their own what is constitutional and what is not. Now, ultimately, Jackson did pay a price for this, I think you could say. Jackson's supporters, of course, celebrated Jackson's decision. They compared it to Jesus driving the money changers out of the temple in the New Testament. And in fact, political cartoons at the time depicted Jackson as driving the money changers out of the temple by driving the national bank with his veto message. You can see him holding the veto message there in his hand, slaying the many-headed hydra of the bank, each one of the heads of that hydra being one of the bank presidents in the different states of the different branches of the national bank. Jackson was hailed as a hero by his supporters. He was seen as, again, as a defender of the people by doing this, going after the money interests of the North and the money interests that were controlling this bank through foreign investment and so on. But to his critics, Jackson was King Andrew I of veto memory. And you can see the depiction of Jackson there with his hand holding his veto message in one hand. And if you look down at the bottom of the political cartoon there, you see him stomping on the Constitution of the United States as he does it. That picture of Jackson was the picture that many people saw as the true Andrew Jackson, the Andrew Jackson that was asserting presidential authority well beyond what anyone had asserted before, and certainly they thought beyond what the founders intended for the president. Jackson, I suppose you could say, ultimately got the last laugh in all this. In the election of 1832, he easily beat Henry Clay for the presidency. Not only did he get more popular votes than Henry Clay, he overwhelmed Clay in the Electoral College in the voting. So I suppose you could say this whole plan kind of backfired on Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. But it did paint Jackson in a very critical way. And after that, the bank controversy, Jackson was really seen by many people who had originally supported him as really trying to be more dictatorial as a president. But that notion of leadership and that notion of asserting presidential authority is exactly the kind of thing that drew presidents like Theodore Roosevelt or Franklin Roosevelt or Lyndon Johnson or even Ronald Reagan, who saw the presidency as the center of leadership in politics with this very different, much more modern view of the presidency. They saw Jackson as a precursor for that. They saw Jackson as a president who really, for the very first time, asserted this notion of leadership in the presidency. There is one other way to look at this, and I think it's a very interesting way to look at it that's been advanced by a political scientist named Stephen Scaronick. He's a professor at Yale now, and he wrote a very interesting piece and then later a book called Presidential Leadership in Political Time. Scaronick's notion is that presidents often face very similar political situations, even though they live in very different eras. And he's convinced that there's a kind of repetition, a cycle, if you will, of the way in which these political moments come up during different presidencies. And I want to just present very briefly a kind of very quick picture of his argument, because I think it relates directly to the other reason why I think Jackson plays such an important role in our notion of the presidency. Scaronick says that there are certain presidents that he calls reconstructive presidents. And he puts Andrew Jackson in this category, as well as Franklin Roosevelt. He says Jackson and Roosevelt were very similar in the political situation that they faced when they became president. And I'm going to suggest to you that perhaps we should be putting Donald Trump in some of these categories as well. So let me explain the category first, and then we'll look at how it relates to these particular presidents. Scaronick says that these reconstructive presidencies happen at a time of political upheaval. There's a great deal of confusion about politics and what the political parties stand for. And because of that confusion, the old ruling party, the sort of old guard of the ruling party, is conflicted and sometimes even kind of falling apart, fraying at the edges. So these reconstructed presidents step into that fray. They step in at those moments and they redefine their political party. They recast it in a new light. People are unhappy with the way things are going. There's a great deal of discontent in the air. And because of that, they tend to rally behind one of these figures that provides them with a new direction for their political party, a new sense of what their party stands for. And very often that means that there are new majorities that get elected to Congress as this person takes office. Now, that was certainly true for Jackson in 1828. It was certainly true for Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. In both cases, Jackson and Roosevelt really redefined what the Democratic Party was all about. Jackson turning the party into this populist party looking out for the common person and doing battle with the bank and the money interests against it. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, with the New Deal and addressing the Great Depression, taking on again the moneyed interests that had been protected from much of the effects of the Depression and standing up again for the common person who was suffering because of the Depression. That notion of things falling apart and this president reconstructing things and bringing things back together again is what constitutes this kind of presidency. So when this happens, what these presidents do is they come in and they either abandon what the party used to stand for and create a whole new understanding of it, or they consolidate their power through what he calls structural reform. They change government and the nature of government through new programs, new kinds of ways of addressing the problems of the day. Jackson did it, as we mentioned, through the Smailes system, right? Bringing new people in, redefining the Democratic Party as the party of the common person, handing out political jobs to people who had no real experience, but jobs that anyone could do, as we saw earlier, he claimed. And then, of course, the bank veto itself, right? Changing the structure of the banking system, doing away with the national bank, trying to reconstruct the banking system so that it didn't favor these particular interests who were behind the national bank. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, very much the same kind of action, right? Bringing in new dealers who began to rethink government and the role of government in the early 1930s, going too far, perhaps, with what was known as his court packing plan, trying to put new members on the Supreme Court that would support those programs, certainly consolidating much of that effort in things like the National Recovery Act and so on. Structural reform that, again, was meant to turn power away from those who had been exercising it and giving it back to, as they argued, the people. And certainly, I think you could argue that Trump positioned himself in much the same way, appointing, instead of loyalists to an idea like the New Deal, though, or the political party, as Jackson's Smailes system did, appointing people who were loyalists to Donald Trump himself, kind of personal loyalists to Donald Trump, abandoning much of what the Republican Party had stood for up until that point, to the consternation of some Republicans who really weren't ready to do that. Things like, for example, giving up on the idea of balancing the budget, adding to the deficit without being concerned about balancing the budget with the Tax Reform Act in 2017, opposing free trade, and certainly the idea of installing tariffs again and trade wars, turning his back on coalition building and talking about America going it alone and not needing other countries and so on. A complete reworking, in other words, of what the Republican Party had stood for all the way through the Reagan years and the other presidents, or other Republican presidents who had followed. So people like John McCain or perhaps somebody like Mitt Romney, very unhappy with the direction the party was going under President Trump, as Trump tried to remake the party in his own image. So was Donald Trump, like these other two presidents, a kind of reconstructive president? Is that why he's drawn to Andrew Jackson as a figure? Well, I certainly think that's one way you could argue this. Jackson's appeal comes to someone like Franklin Roosevelt and perhaps to Donald Trump because they face similar political moments and very similar kinds of challenges in remaking their party, whether we agree with what they're remaking them into or not, remaking their party into something new. But there is another way of looking at Scaronick's argument, because Scaronick also talks about what he calls the late regime affiliate presidents. That's a mouthful. But what he means by that is that presidents who are facing the collapse of a political party and trying to manage it in some way. Now, these people tend to be party outsiders. They tend to be people who have not been really a member of or a part of the political party structure up until now. And they come into this because there's this disarray in the establishment. Things are falling apart again. Things are confused. The party's not sure what it stands for anymore. And what these folks do is take advantage of that. They take advantage of the confusion by coming in and saying, I'm the one who can sort all this out. I can take this party over and take it in a direction where we can sort of reconstruct where the party is going. So they come in with this intention, in other words, of trying to take advantage of this confusion to get support for themselves. In the Republican Party, arguably, that was the Reagan sort of position, the conservative movement around Ronald Reagan, and the direction that the Republican Party was going, and the conflicts within it about what its priority should really be. But instead of saving that party and saving the establishment, they end up bringing it down. They end up destroying it, turning it into something that then has to be reconstructed by someone else later, a president who follows. So these presidents who play this role of being the late regime affiliate are really kind of political opportunists who are seizing the moment of confusion, getting people to support them, being critical of what came before, but not really being able to offer anything permanent to replace it. And so instead of seeming to be central figures in redefining their political parties, they instead seem to be failures, people who are not reelected to office, who are not seen as being the true leader of the party, who again seem to be outsiders for where the party is going. Scaronick says presidents, for example, like Herbert Hoover and Jimmy Carter, he says, both played this role. Hoover with the collapse of the Republican Party, with the Great Depression. Jimmy Carter, of course, with the collapse of what was really the Great Society sort of coalition that President Johnson had put together in the 1960s. Is Donald Trump the herald of the end of the old establishment of the Republican Party, but ultimately to be replaced by something else? Or is Donald Trump one of these reconstructive presidents who in fact is redefining his political party? Well, of course, it's too early to tell, isn't it? It's very difficult to know where all this is going because we don't know whether President Trump's hold or former President Trump's hold on the political party will be something that will be consistent over the next few years. It will be very interesting to see, in other words, how much influence former President Trump has on the midterm elections and the election in 2024, whether he's a candidate or backing the candidate or selecting a candidate to support in 2024, as to whether or not he continues to play this central role in the Republican Party. If he does, one could argue that he seems to be reconstructing the party in his own image. If he's not, and the Republican Party struggles as a result, then arguably he may well be one of these presidents that really fits into the second category of late regime affiliates. By the way, Scaronick himself has said that he really thinks that Donald Trump fits in the second category better than the first. And I certainly don't want to speak for Professor Scaronick, but his latest edition of the book has sort of struggled with this question and asking where to put Donald Trump. And he seems to lean in the direction of Trump really being this transient figure that the party will have to reestablish itself after he's gone, because it's not altogether clear whether or not that leadership will continue. But clearly, presidents like Andrew Jackson are at the center of all this. And I think you could really make the case that not only did Jackson assert a brand new notion of the presidency, a more modern notion of the presidency with his bank veto, but he also played a very important reconstructive role for the Democratic Party and ultimately set an example of how a president can be integral in redefining a political party and putting it in a new direction. And I think, again, that's why other presidents who have seen themselves in that kind of role have pointed to Andrew Jackson as an example of what they see as an important president, because they see much of themselves in what Jackson is doing, both in terms of their own desire to use political power and influence to achieve their political goals, but also because they see themselves as playing this role of reconstructing politics around a new beginning, a new direction, and ultimately perhaps even a new kind of presidency. So with that, let me stop, and I'll ask Janet to maybe consult the chat and see what kind of questions we might address in all this.
Yes, we've got some questions that
Great.
came through during the chat. Let's see here. So if the president now is a political leader rather than, as the founders envisioned, the defender of the Constitution, who now then is the defender of the Constitution? And this begs the question, does the Constitution need defending?
Excellent questions. Two very good ones. Well, you know, what's interesting about this role of defending the Constitution was that the Supreme Court itself really asserted its authority in deciding the constitutionality of laws in 1803 in Marbury versus Madison, one of its most important, if not the most important, decision the court made. So when John Marshall, the very same John Marshall who decided McCulloch versus Maryland, when John Marshall asserted that it was the Supreme Court's job to decide these things, it really in many ways took away what the founders arguably perceived as a presidential role in defending the Constitution. Now, that doesn't mean the president can't still get a bill, look at the Constitution, and decide whether or not they consider that bill constitutional. But what it does mean is that the president is not the final word in that the Supreme Court, in fact, is. And really, ever since the Supreme Court has played that role, the president's role as the defender of the Constitution in that sense has been diminished over time. But it's important to know that the Supreme Court made this decision in 1803 that it decides the constitutionality of laws, and then it didn't exercise that power again until 1857. So it was a very long time before the Supreme Court ever declared a law unconstitutional after it did so in 1803. And it's been more recently that the Supreme Court, of course, has been perceived as the decider of the Constitution by the general public. So nothing in Article 3 gives the Supreme Court that power to declare laws unconstitutional. It took that power on itself, and we have come to accept it, that it's the role of the Supreme Court to make these decisions. But it's one of the more interesting parts about our constitutional system that there is nothing in the Constitution that actually says that. It is a power that was asserted by the court, that's become accepted by the public, and our political system has treated the power of the court with respect around that power. And certainly Daniel Webster was defending it, as he saw in his speech, even though there is nothing in the Constitution that specifically says that the Constitution is going to be interpreted and decided by the Supreme Court. I think the Constitution does need defending, and I'll tell you why. Part of the reason is because the experience in the state governments, when they first wrote their early constitutions, they had no courts or really an executive power limiting their state legislatures. So their state legislatures could pass any laws they wanted to, including amending their own state constitutions. So if a state wanted to pass a law and their constitution said they couldn't do it, they could just change the Constitution. They could literally rewrite the rules as they went. Well, you know, like with any game that you're playing, you can't rewrite the rules in the middle of the game, right? You can't suddenly decide there are going to be 4 outs in an inning instead of 3 outs in an inning. Someone has to maintain those rules in order for the political system to work. So because of that, we do need someone to defend the principles of the Constitution, to pronounce what those principles are. But as I say, it's really fallen to the Supreme Court to do that because the court asserted that power, and we've come to accept that. So, sorry, that was a long answer to a short question, but it's a really good question. I had to go on a bit about that. So go ahead, Jenna.
Yes, good question, good answer. Are there any references to the duties of the president with regard to maintaining the public peace?
Well, it is part of the charge in the Article 2 that the laws take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And by that, the interpretation of that phrase has always been that the president is, in essence, the chief law enforcer of the country. And so, yes, in the sense that maintaining the law and through that maintaining the peace is an executive function. And much of the executive branch is actually all about carrying out that charge, right? All the different agencies of government that execute the laws that have been passed by Congress, things like the EPA and the FAA and the FEC and so on, those are all examples of the executive power being used to execute the law and make sure that the laws are faithfully executed. And presumably at times the commander-in-chief power can give the president that authority as well. But much of that has to hinge on Congress's action, not the president's. It's really up to Congress to make many of the decisions around how when the commander-in-chief role is going to be played by the president. And the founders are very careful to separate those two functions.
This person wants to know the same thing I do. Is there definitive evidence that there was no deal to make Adams president in 1824?
Was the big lie not a lie? I mean, that's a very interesting question. Jackson certainly thought it was true. There doesn't seem to be any evidence that it was true. He thought there was a collusion. When John Quincy Adams became president, he made Henry Clay, I believe, as Secretary of State, if I remember the office correctly. And because of that, Jackson charged that there had been some kind of deal that was made. But as far as I know, I don't think any historian has actually proven that that was the case. It was a kind of natural choice in many ways for John Quincy Adams because Clay was a leading political figure in the country. And at the time, John Quincy Adams thought that was a very important office to have some kind of national stature, somewhat of national stature in it. So Clay was a natural choice to be put into that office. So I think it had much more to do with Henry Clay's qualities than it did any kind of collusion or deal behind the scenes between the two.
What replaced the bank?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, of course, today we have the Federal Reserve System that does a lot of the functions that the national bank was expected to do. But a very interesting thing that happened after Jackson's veto, almost immediately there was a kind of collapse of confidence in banks. And there was a bank panic in 1837 that set off a decline in the national economy as a result. People began to doubt, for example, whether or not the paper money that they had was worth what it said that it was worth. And so there was a moment of panic, you might say, in the banking system when the national bank finally was dismantled by Jackson and Jackson's Secretary of the Treasury. But in the end, the state banks really took over much of what the national banks were doing. And so it really kind of balanced itself out in the end. But it really fell to the states to do more, to run the banking system more than the national government until we had the bank crisis in the Great Depression. And during that time, of course, the federal government began to step in and regulate banks much more carefully. So that's where the Federal Reserve System comes in for the regulating the commerce, regulating the money supply, the Department of Commerce, and some of the laws that were passed even during Theodore Roosevelt's administration for regulating commerce and so on. So it's its duties really got sort of broken up in many different directions as a result.
This person says that connecting Donald Trump and FDR seems an anathema to them. I think
I'm sure it does.
You touched on this a little, but could you expand on some of the structural reform that you would attribute to Donald Trump?
Sure. I'm not sure that Trump really exercised a lot of structural reforms within the government. I think what Trump did more so was to make use of the power of appointment and the sort of personal loyalty that it demanded from the people who were in his administration to really go the other direction, to really sort of remake or restructure the way in which power was exercised during the Trump years. So it's not so much a reform of the institutions of government so much as it was a change in personnel and the way in which people were chosen for office to occupy appointed offices during the Trump years. And it's a very unusual kind of appointment. I'll give you an example just as a contrast. Reagan and Reagan's people had a very strict standard of who they appointed to office. They wanted what they considered to be true conservatives. So if you were looking for a job in the Reagan administration, you had to demonstrate in some way that you were true to conservative principles. You had to have belonged to certain societies or written things that were in public that demonstrated your interest and loyalty in conservative principles before you would be considered for appointment to office. So there was a kind of litmus test, as it was called, for people who wanted to work in the Reagan administration as to whether or not they were true conservatives. President Trump had a very different standard because his standard was not loyalty to a political idea, because Trump's sort of view of politics really wasn't driven by a very clear, coherent ideology. His standard was political loyalty or personal loyalty to Donald Trump himself. So were you with us or against us in the election in 2016? Have you demonstrated your loyalty to the president? Have you been critical of the president in some way? If so, you're not going to stay in office. You're not going to get a position with us. I've just been reading John Carl's very interesting book, Betrayal, about the last few years of the Trump administration. And one of the things that he talks about at length is the fact that there was a kind of purge of people on occasion within the Trump administration, of people who had not demonstrated sufficient personal loyalty to the president. And many of them were kicked out of office if they had said something publicly that was critical of the president or critical of the president's position on issues. So it was a very different kind of standard of loyalty that Trump tried to use to try to restructure and redirect his administration, but very, very different than Roosevelt, who really tried to do it much more through political programs in the New Deal.
Do you think Lincoln should also be considered a reconstructive president?
It's a very interesting question. Scaronick doesn't put Lincoln in that category, but I think you could maybe make an argument that he was. I mean, certainly when it came to defining the Republican Party and what it stood for, I think Lincoln was a pivotal figure in that, in those decisions. And I don't want to speak for Professor Scaronick. I don't know how he handles Lincoln in his book. I know how he handles him in his early versions of this notion of political time. But I will say that I think in many ways, Lincoln himself was also a pivotal figure in defining what his political party represented. And like Jackson, staffed his positions in his administration with people who were loyal Republicans, who were party members. In that sense, that old notion of the spoils system hadn't gone away, even in Lincoln's time. So, but certainly Lincoln played that kind of role. Lincoln's a very complicated figure to look at, though, because much of what Lincoln had to deal with was really forced upon him by the Civil War. It's a very interesting question to ask. If the Civil War had not happened, would we even remember Abraham Lincoln? Would he be one of those many other names of presidents in the 19th century that go by us? Would he be a Buchanan, Polk, Lincoln, Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison? Who are these guys, right? What did they do? Well, had it not been for the Civil War, Lincoln could have very easily been in that category. So as Lincoln himself said, events controlled him more than he controlled events. I'm paraphrasing, but that was essentially Lincoln's attitude towards his presidency, and it certainly was true. So Lincoln was in a very different, interesting position. One thing I will say, though, and I talk to my students about this at length when I teach my presidency class, Lincoln actually stayed within these conventions of this notion of the president not as a political leader. He very rarely spoke in public. He did not lead on domestic issues in the way that later presidents would. And in fact, he took advantage of the few moments the presidents do give speeches, typically in inaugural addresses. So of course, we remember much of what Lincoln said in his first and second inaugural. And of course, the Gettysburg Address, which was really nothing more than a dedication ceremony where Lincoln was meant to give a very, very few brief words, as he typically did at other openings and events as president, more just a courtesy of the president to give a little short dedication, much as you would give a speech before you cut the ribbon of a new hospital, perhaps, or christen a new boat. And the Gettysburg Address was that moment. He was not the featured speaker that day. Edward Everett was, but Lincoln took advantage of that very brief moment and that very brief opportunity, of course, to redefine what the Civil War was all about. So Lincoln was very canny about using his opportunities to do these moments of leadership, even though he did not exceed the bounds of what was considered then the proper role of the president in all of that. So it's a very interesting figure. I could go on at length about Lincoln, and I won't do that now, but it's a very interesting figure around that way he exercised his office. So sorry, Jenna, go ahead.
I'm gonna group these next two questions together because they're kind of related. So part one is, did Congress try to override Jackson's veto? And then part two is, how can the president be the ultimate judge of constitutionality historically when Congress can override them?
Both good questions. Clearly, what the founders had in mind was that if the Congress by a large margin, 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate, were convinced that the president was mistaken in how the president read the Constitution, they were provided with this opportunity to override a presidential veto. And the founders expected that that would be a very rare event. They really were convinced that most presidents would use this power well, that even though there weren't political parties back then, their expectation was that people would judge the action of the president based on what the president issued in this veto message and would be likely to be convinced by the president's arguments about the constitutionality of a particular bill that the president vetoed. And historically, that's turned out to be true. Presidential vetoes have only been overridden about 6% of the time that Congress has tried to have override votes. So presidential vetoes stick. There's no question about it. Even though we've had some occasional overrides in recent years that have been more successful, vetoes are vetoes for the most part. So the expectation was that, the veto power would be a very powerful tool for the president to use. And as a result, the expectation was that presidents would use it very rarely. And that was certainly true even in Jackson's day. There were very few moments where earlier presidents had used the veto for constitutional grounds. And each time that they did it, that veto also stuck. It also was maintained. Did they try to override Jackson's veto? They didn't have the votes to do that, and they knew it. So as a result, they did not try to override his veto. They did later censure Jackson, though, and blamed him for the way in which he carried out the decision to end the national bank. He fired his Secretary of the Treasury, who he thought was not aggressive enough in dismantling the bank. And Congress actually took him to task for that, saying that he had no right to fire that person. And they officially censured him as a result. But they weren't able to override his veto, no.
And I'm not sure how much you'll be able to answer this next one, but someone's wondering, do we know who was behind the choice to hang Jackson's portrait in Donald Trump's office during his tenure? Was it Trump himself, or was it like members of his cabinet? Was there historical knowledge there? Or
that's a really good question. From everything that I've read, it was Donald Trump himself. And I don't know that I could confirm that. Everything I've read has said Donald Trump selected a portrait of Jackson to be hung by the Resolute desk. Now, does that mean people within within Trump's immediate circle? I don't know that. I'm assuming it means what it means, that Trump actually was the one who made that decision. Trump had talked about Jackson at times during the campaign. Jackson was not a stranger to Donald Trump. And so Trump liked to draw the comparison between himself and Jackson very often in his speeches. So I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility and likelihood that actually Trump made that decision himself. I might also mention that Joe Biden had it taken down when he became president. And right now, Benjamin Franklin's picture stands next to the Resolute desk in that spot. Read into that what you will, why Joe Biden chose Benjamin Franklin in particular to hang there. But Ben Franklin's picture is there now. And again, apparently that was a decision specifically made by Joe Biden, from everything I've read.
Okay, we've got two more comments and questions here.
Sure.
Were there political parties in England at the time of the founding of the U.S.?
Political parties in England, there were in England, yes. There were not really well-formed political parties in the United States during this time because we were in a very interesting time of transition. And not to wade too deeply into this, but during the 1820s, there really was only one political party, the Democrat Republicans. The old Federalist Party had died out at that point. And the dispute in the 1824 election with these four different candidates came about not because they represented different political parties, but because they represented different regions of the country. And as a result, it was really a regional contest more than a party contest in 1824. Now, by 1828, Jackson had begun to coalesce the Democratic Party into a new political party, again, around himself and his principles. And so in remaking the Democratic Party and reconstituting the Democratic Party, excuse me, Jackson had really created a more cohesive political party. As a result, the anti-Jackson forces, people like Clay and Webster, ended up creating essentially a party in response that they called the National Republican Party for a short period of time, not to be confused with the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln, but taking the old name Democrat Republican and now sort of taking the Republican part of that name. They called themselves the National Republicans at first, but by the time Jackson was on his way out of office, they had reconstituted themselves into what was known then as the Whig Party. And the Whig Party became, in essence, the opposition party to the Democratic Party because of Jackson and Jackson's organization of the Democratic Party. Then a few decades later, the Whigs fell apart, and ultimately, because of that, the Lincoln Republican Party emerged and became the modern Republican Party. So you can really trace the Republican Party back to Lincoln, and you can really trace the Democratic Party back to Jackson, and arguably even further back to Jefferson, because Jefferson was the one who started the Democratic Republican Party that Jackson and ultimately everybody else in the 1820s belonged to. So when Democrats celebrate their party, they hold fundraisers every year. They often have a dinner associated with it. They call them Jefferson-Jackson Day dinners. And the Republicans, of course, call theirs Lincoln Day dinners because of the founders of their two political parties.
And final comment here, Jackson might have set an example of an impactful presidency. His treatment of people of color is still disgraceful.
Absolutely. Again, that's the two sides of Jackson. And that's why I started where I did. I don't think we can ever dismiss that side of Andrew Jackson. And certainly Jackson is ultimately the most divisive political figure of his day. And I would perhaps argue that the same kind of passions that people feel around former President Trump, either supporting him or disliking him, either seeing him as a saint or the sinner, is really the same kind of attitude that people had towards Jackson. And even in Jackson's day, people were very critical of his treatment of Native Americans. Not so critical among some people of his enslavement of people, but certainly the abolitionists of his day were very critical of Jackson for that reason. And of course, historically, we can't ignore the fact that Jackson was a president who did not respect human rights among many people who were impacted by his decisions and ultimately his policies as president. So no, I do think we have to keep that in mind, and I certainly think it's one of the good reasons for removing Andrew Jackson from the $20 bill. I'll go even that far. Jackson, it was a pretty reprehensible character when it came to issues of race in particular. And there's no doubt about that. And I think for many people, they struggle with that two sides of Jackson, the populists that they can applaud and the racists that they have to condemn. It is, you get both with Andrew Jackson, unfortunately.
Well, that brings us in a beautiful, complete circle all the way back to where we started. I want to thank you so much for being here tonight and sharing your expertise and research with us. I want to invite all of you who are here tonight to come join us next Thursday. Tim Riley will be talking about Tina Turner. So totally different topic, but we hope to see everybody there. One more time in the chat, I'm going to go ahead and put our program evaluation form. We would love to hear from you and to see if you have any suggestions for the future. And thank you again so much, Dr. Smailes. We look forward to seeing you next time.
It's a lot of fun. Thank you.